All right, folks, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to see all of you. Let's do a quick good morning. Let's do this all together before I mute everybody. This is our time to make a lot of noise. Good morning.
Good morning.
I love it. I love it. Okay, at this point, I am going to mute everybody, but you should know that you still have the power to unmute yourselves at any point in time so that you can speak or ask a question or share a comment. The goal is always to have these sessions as interactive as possible, so I encourage you to share, to ask, and to make sure that we're learning together in a enjoyable fashion. Okay, so I am broadcasting from the comfort and safety, please God, of my own home, as I know that many of, as it looks like you all are in your homes. I am sharing my home with a bunch of people who happen to be my family, my children, who are, thank God, all on Zoom classes. So we all have our respective rooms. I've been relegated to the bowling trophy room. If you notice, there's a bowling pin over my shoulder. Do you see that? You guys see that? That is a memento from my 300 game. Not the game that I bowled 300, but my 300th game of bowling a good solid 63. Anyway, but that's another story. So no, this is actually a bowling pin that my son got at some point in time when he was bowling and he got the best score, whatever. But I'm in a room, and it's great to be here with you, and I'm excited to learn about prophecy together with you. So last week at the end of the class, I predicted that this week our topic would be prophecy, and it turns out that my prediction was correct. I will therefore, I feel like I'm qualified to go out on a limb at this point and say I probably had a prophetic vision last week to know that this week we're talking about prophecy. Well, either that or because I know what I'm teaching each week. But either way, today we talk about prophecy, and it got me thinking. I recently, first of all, by raise of hand, who listens to podcasts? Okay. Not everybody's screen is on, which is fine. But from those that are on, I saw a lot of hands go up regarding podcasts. I'm a podcast listener. I enjoy listening to podcasts. In fact, I have my own podcast, right, which is a podcast of Jewish study and Jewish teachings. It's called, for those that are interested, it's called Knowledge on the Deeper Side. Knowledge on the Deeper Side. Anyway, I digress. This is not meant to be a commercial for my podcast. The reason why I mention this is I was recently listening to a podcast about Waco, Texas. You remember Waco, Texas? I mean, it still exists. I don't mean like remember because it's not around. It still exists. But do you remember David Koresh, 1993? Yes, Mount Carmel, Branch Davidians, Janet Reno, ATF, FBI. Yes? Okay. So I'm listening to a podcast about David Koresh and about this whole situation. And it talks about what was going on, and insiders look at what was going on inside the compound, what he was doing. It talks about mistakes, many mistakes that were made by the ATF and other government agencies. And it presents, I think, a pretty balanced picture of what went on. And it's very compelling on many levels. But one thing that's really fascinating is that his whole deal, and by his I mean David Koresh, who was not born David Koresh. He took on that name in 1990, 3 years before April 1993, when the government went in with the raid. So David Koresh presented himself as a prophet. That was his deal. He told people that he was a prophet, right? By the way, you don't need to worry. about me at all, I am very non-profit. Okay, so that is for sure, like, that's okay. Anyway, David Koresh presented himself as a prophet, and he told everybody, he told people, he told his followers that he is a prophet and he is bringing the word of God. That's it. That's what he said. He said, God told me this and God told me that, and he would give sermons and share, the latest breaking news of what God told him. And a lot of it involved, salvation and final reckonings and standoffs, and that's why they had to be armed for the final standoff. And it's very interesting because it was pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy, how he was speaking about this government standoff, and therefore we need all these guns and all this training and these grenades and launchers and whatnot, and then that triggered the government to come in and do a raid and have that standoff. And it's kind of like mind-blowing that actually literally was a self-fulfilling, oh no, I dare say, prophecy, but not in that way. Is there such a thing as prophecy? Or is the whole thing Baba Mises, which means fake news? I mean, that's like the original version of that, right? Is the whole thing just, a fairy tale and not actually true? Is there a thing called prophecy? What is prophecy, if it is a thing? Who might be a prophet? What are the qualifications? How do we know when a prophet is legit or not legit, right? These are all basic questions, fundamental questions. This course is looking at the 13 principles of Jewish faith, which we explained last week is less about faith as suspension of rational thinking and more about ideals that we're meant to be faithful to. In other words, teachings and ideals that are meant to be lived by, frankly, meant to somehow enhance our life and somehow make for a more connected life and a spiritually richer life. So today we're going to look at another two of the 13 principles. Last week we looked at number 10, which spoke about God's omniscience and providence, which means that God knows all and sees all and cares about all, which we said is a very big break. It very much diverges from the perspective of the Greek philosophers, for example, Aristotle, who believed in some sort of first cause or primordial being, but didn't believe that, well, let's just call that God, didn't believe that God had any association or affiliation with the world. Rather, the world was run by all of these other forces and by human beings, because frankly, simply, they could not, the philosophers, including Aristotle, could not fathom a reality in which a perfect God was somehow enmeshed and involved in such an imperfect world. Whereas Judaism believes that we don't get to tell God what to do, right? We don't get to create an image of God that is too big to fit into this world, because by doing so, precisely in the process of trying to make God big, we've made God small, because we've limited God to the high and not to the low, and that's also a limitation. I didn't have a chance to really elaborate on this last week. We kind of ran out of time at the end. But I feel like it might be relevant to mention right now this a bit of an analogy for this. Let's talk about two different teachers. Let's say you have a teacher that's really good at teaching kindergarten or maybe preschool. A teacher that's really good at teaching younger kids, early education. Okay? Put them into a classroom of maybe advanced physics. Maybe that's not their strong suit. Maybe they won't be able to teach that class. But young children, to get them, to teach them the basics, to teach social, emotional development, and all of the early childhood, all of that incredible pedagogy that's involved, they're an excellent teacher in that environment. But advanced, college, university level classes on physics and quantum physics, they're not going to be able to pull that off. Okay, that's one teacher. You have another teacher. The other teacher is a high level university level professor. This professor can teach a class of grad students advanced, gosh, I don't even know, astrophysics. Is that a thing? Astrophysics? Yeah? Okay. Like super high level, whatever like the highest level science is. Wonderful. But put them into a classroom of 5-year-olds, it'll be chaos. Right? They'll have no idea what to do. It's going to be just absolute chaos. So I'll ask you a question. Who's the better teacher? There's no right answer. There's no answer. Who's the better teacher? One can teach this level and one can teach that level. Which is a better level? I don't know if there's better or worse. You have education on this level and education on that level. Now, you might say that one is teaching, if you go through all the years, right? If you go through the years of education, so one is more advanced, academically, and more advanced educationally, or it takes more years to get to that teacher. Okay, that's true, but which is better? I don't know. That's a judgment. I don't know what's better or worse, right? But each one possesses a limitation, right? The early childhood expert, again, not all early childhood experts are not able to teach. Maybe someone can teach all across, but I'm giving a specific example. In this example, the early childhood educator cannot teach the advanced class, and the advanced professor cannot teach the early education, the preschool, the kindergarten class, which means that each teacher has a limitation, right? They're stuck where they are in their specialty, which is fine, but it still constitutes a limitation. So the philosophers, and they meant well, but the philosophers had the same approach to God. They humanized God. They said, look, we are masters of our domain, right? We're masters of earth. We're masters of this reality. And God is a master of the higher spiritual reality. But just as we're stuck here, God is stuck there. Just like the teacher, the early educator is stuck in preschool, the professor is stuck in the university. That's what they believed. And to that, Judaism says, not that Judaism was responding to that, but as Maimonides articulates in his 10th principle, which we explained last week, our perception of God is the ultimate teacher. God can teach the advanced class, and God can also jump into the early education class. And you know what? In that preschool class, he can already drop hints, drop clues, drop hints about things that they will learn, the children will learn as they advance. Think about that teacher, right? Think about a teacher that can teach adults and teach kids, and even when teaching kids, plant the seeds for growth for the bigger stuff and drop clues about things that will be uncovered later. That's very cool. That's the Jewish approach to God. God is so big, God's not stuck being big. God can also fit into a small place. God can also condense himself into finite reality. I'm going to say that one more time because that's a critical line for today's class. God is so not big. God is so infinite, which infinite is not just big. Infinite is beyond all bounds. God is so infinite that God can even compress himself into a finite space. Like the ultimate teacher who can condense his or her wisdom into the understanding of even a small child. That's the ultimate teacher. Does what I'm saying make sense so far? Yes? Okay. Good. I'm getting enough head nods that I feel comfortable continuing. Okay. So, with this, we can understand Oh, and by the way, I'm using masculine pronouns for God. I'm referring to God as He. It's just by habit and by popular, I don't know, whatever, popular English construct that we use a masculine pronoun. But God is, well, as I don't want to give too much away, but as we'll see in this course, we have other principles of God other principles of Judaism and Jewish faith that tell us clearly that God does not possess bodily form, i.e., any form of gender whatsoever. So, as you hear me talk about God as a He did this, He compressed Himself, condensed Himself. I want you to understand where I'm coming from. I'm by no means implying that God is a He. God is not a He. God does not have a body. If we picture God as an old guy sitting on a throne with a long white beard, okay, but try to work on getting rid of that, because that's not all what God is. Which takes us to principles number 6 and 7. You may notice we're going out of order. We started with 10. We're segueing into 6 and 7. But this is by design to kind of work us through a methodical progression. Okay, principle number 6 of the 13 principles of Jewish belief, and number 7 pertain to prophecy. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and let us read together number 6. Can you guys see my screen? Yes? I'm going to make it much bigger. Okay, here we go. Maimonides. As you see at the top of the page here, it says the 6th principle. So here's number 6. Maimonides writes, the 6th principle concerns prophecy. We must realize that there exist human beings who have such lofty qualities and achieve such great perfection that their souls become prepared to receive pure spiritual wisdom. The human intellect can then become bound up with the divine intellect and receive an inspired emanation from it. This is prophecy, and people who achieve it are the prophets. Okay, so let me explain what we just read. Maimonides is telling us that there are people that are highly spiritually developed and intellectually, who are able to connect, their minds are able to connect with divine intelligence, and therefore they have a prophetic experience. They're able to align their mind with this so-called level of divine intelligence. And that constitutes prophecy. So that's principle number 6. Question is, first of all, what does that mean? And how do we do that? You know, is there an app for that? Well, maybe that's a question that somebody might ask. But also the question is, why is this important for us to know? Like, why is this a principle of Judaism? Why is this one of the foundational teachings of Judaism? Why is it relevant? And so that's why I reintroduced briefly principle number 10, because that's a critical connection point. Based on last week's discussion, we can understand why number 6, why prophecy is a thing. And so I'll explain. Prophecy can be understood in different ways. It could be understood as somebody who is now going off and, spreading messages. But if you notice, that's not what Maimonides says. Maimonides says simply it's the ability that a human being has to be aligned with divine intelligence. It's not about necessarily telling other people what to do. Do you notice that? Maimonides never said, and you know what a prophet does? A prophet then goes tells everybody what they're doing wrong. Here's what you need to do. God told me, y'all got it wrong. This is what you need to be doing. That's not what he says. Prophecy and the experience of a prophet and the experience of prophecy is someone whose mind is aligned with the divine. That's it. What does it mean? This is the extent of the Jewish belief. that God is not limited by transcendence. I'll say that one more time. This principle number 6, expresses the extent to which Judaism maintains that God is not stuck up there. God is not stuck in the space beyond. God is also found within. We learned that last week. And this week we up it a notch. Because God is found also within our reality, therefore God and divine wisdom is accessible and attainable by human beings that are ready for it. Does that make sense what I just said? Yes? Sort of? Okay. In other words, if you follow the philosophical approach, the Greek philosophical approach, that says that God is way out there, God is way beyond, good luck aligning with that message, with divine intelligence. Divine intelligence is not accessible. However, if you posit, as Judaism does, that God is very accessible, that God, because God is truly infinite, God makes himself accessible even within a finite reality, then guess what? Even within a finite human mind, there can merge infinite divine intelligence. How can you have infinite in a finite place? That's exactly where you can have the infinite. How do you know it's really infinite? If it can even exist in a finite place. Because true infinity means it's not bound by any boundaries, even by the typical construct of higher and lower, as again we've explained before and last week. So prophecy is less about somebody giving people messages and telling them what to do and what not to do, and more about a fundamental belief or a fundamental notion and awareness about God, that God is so present and divine energy is so present that by those that have the right frequency, they can tap into those signals. I've used this example in classes recently, in other classes, the example of radio waves, right? There are radio waves, radio stations that are buzzing around your head right now. How do I know this? Because if you put in a radio next to you and you turn it on and you tune it in, you're going to catch those channels, which means it's right around you. It's right around your head. Maybe it's even going through us. I don't know how how those radio waves flow. I don't know enough about radio waves to know if they penetrate, how deeply they penetrate. But it might be even touching. We know it's touching our skin, but it may be even going a little bit through our skin. So here's the incredible thing: they're all around us, but we don't hear it unless you chew on a piece of foil. I'm kidding, right? You don't hear it unless you tune into the right frequency. And that's the same idea as prophecy. What is prophecy at its core, according to the Jewish understanding of prophecy? Prophecy is a human being who has risen to a certain state of mind and state of character, which we'll see in a moment, which is very important for a David Koresh example. A person who has risen to a certain state where they are attuned, they're able to tune into, I use the old school knob of radio tuning. They're able to tune into the frequency of divine intelligence and catch some signals, catch some programming. That's what prophecy is, straight up. Which means there's always a way that other people simply are not able to do so. That we'll get to in a moment. But understand the essential notion of prophecy is a human being able to tune in, which again is only possible if you believe, as Judaism does, that God is tune-inable. I know that's not a word, but that God makes himself accessible. Other belief systems don't make God accessible. God is way out there. There are other things, intermediaries, that are accessible, but not God. Judaism Judaism maintains that God is absolutely accessible because of this fundamental belief in how truly infinite God is, that God is not stuck in that space. Beyond, God is also found within. So that's the opening idea about prophecy. Now let's continue. I'm going to share my screen. Let's go through some more texts about the notion of what prophecy is and who is granted these prophetic visions. Okay, that was text 1, which we read. Oh, here we go. Here's a bit of a, it's an activity, but we're not going to do the activity. We don't have to do the activity. I just want to show you this list. So here are the first 9 principles of Maimonides, which we covered number 10 last week. But just so you know, here are the 9, and here's where 6 and 7 fit in. So principle number 1 is God exists. Okay, that's a good place to start. Number 2 is God is one. Number 3, which I mentioned before, I alluded to before, God has no body, which also means no gender, right? Number 4, although again it uses the word he, the pronoun he, God always existed. And number 5, no other forces have power independent of God. Those are the first 5, which we will elaborate on in this course. Don't you worry. We are going to dive deep into all of these. Number 6 and 7 are today's discussion. God communicates with humans via prophecy, and Moses enjoyed a unique level of prophecy. Those are 6 and 7, which we'll explore today. 8 and 9 are about Torah and the authenticity of Torah. The Torah is authored by God, and Torah will not be replaced. There's not going to be a new Torah. God doesn't change his mind about what are values and what's right and wrong, etc. Okay, so this is the list of the first 9. A very important list, again, from a Jewish perspective, a critical list of Jewish fundamentals. These are fundamental things that we're meant to be faithful to. 6 and 7 follow 1 through 5. Right? Why do we need to know about prophecy and about Moses? Because it tells us about God, which is 1 through 5. The list of 1 through 5 are features, if you will. I hate using that word, and I apologize using it, but features, aspects or realities of God. It's about God, and 6 and 7 are also about God. God is making himself available because God is present through every dimension, including ours. God is accessible to even human finite intellect if you tune into the right frequency. And Moses experienced that on a unique level. Okay, let's take a look at this explanation as found in text number 2. This is how the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains this 6th principle in a way that I just explained it. Text number 2. Here, Rambam, Maimonides, makes clear that prophecy is not a specific communication to a chosen individual to carry out a certain task or mission. Rather, it is a form of intellectual perfection, a merging of the properly prepared human mind with the divine active intellect. The reason why the prophet is able to deliver a message to the people is because his mind has been illuminated in this elevated state so as to gain heightened levels of knowledge which are usually experienced by God alone. Again, in simple terms, it's a person, a human being, being able to tune in to that frequency of divine active intellect. Let's continue inside. An awareness of this point is a foundation of the Jewish faith because it is a mechanism by which God is revealed in this world. Thus, after reading the first 5 principles that deal with the knowledge of God and the way he is manifested within the creation, a discussion of prophecy is the next logical step. As this is yet a further way of understanding God and his interaction with creation. In other words, God is so immanent, God is so present that God even allows and opens himself up, his active divine intellect, to be made accessible to human beings that are properly prepared. As I was sharing before, we're going to skip text 3. Oh, how does one become a prophet? Okay, we'll get there soon. As I was sharing before about tuning into the radio frequency, I was kind of tuning a manual dial. It reminded me of the first car I ever drove. This is back in the day. Relatively back in the day when I started driving. It was an old Oldsmobile station wagon. Anybody remember those Oldsmobile station wagons? So the first time I drove, my grandmother may her memory be for a blessing. She taught me how to drive. I mean, God bless her. It's it's an amazing thing. She taught me how to drive, and so I remember getting into the car, and you turn on the ignition, and then I put it into reverse. And I think back then they didn't have the thing where you have to push the brake before changing gears. Is that correct? Because that's my memory of it. Yes? I'm not getting a strong response. But okay, maybe. I don't know. I don't think you had to apply the brake before shifting gears, because my recollection, first time I drove, was shifting it into reverse and immediately just rolling backwards and bumping the car behind me. That no damage, thank God, but it was the first, oh, look at that. 1 second in and already hitting another car. But that was my introduction. I've improved, by the way. I've improved. Thank God. I don't know after this. It's been a while since I've driven, but we'll see how the driving skills have held up after we're out and about in a more a regular fashion. Okay, let's talk about the next element, which I showed you a moment ago on the screen. Let's talk about how a person becomes a prophet. Well, we said basically that a person has to reach an elevated state of mind to tune in. Okay, that's kind of general, but specifically, is there more information? And the answer is yes. Okay, this is a Hebrew page. Let's go to the translation. Oh, it looks like the scan got a little bit sideways. All right, you'll have to work with me on reading this a little bit. We'll turn our heads a little bit sideways. Here we go. This is also from Maimonides. One of the foundations of the faith is to know that God visits people in prophetic visions. Now here we go. Here's how. The spirit of prophecy comes only to exceedingly wise people of outstanding characteristics, whose inclinations never lead them to earthly matters, but who always conquer their inclinations and who are of correct temperaments. Angry prophets, you're out, right? No angry prophets here, right? No hedonistic prophets, which we'll get to as I come back to David Koresh. A person who fulfills these criteria and is of perfect health will, studying Pardes, which is the esoteric spiritual wisdom, Kabbalah, and of an appropriate temperament to understand and comprehend them, sanctifying himself by moving away from anybody who concerns himself with its contrivances, with his thoughts permanently directed on high, prophecy will come to him. That's a big list. Before we move on to number 2 in this list, this is very important. Maimonides is listing like 4 or 5, what do we have here? Yeah, what's on the next page? I think 4 or 5 different criteria qualifications for someone to become a prophet. And here we have the first big one, which is basically perfection in intelligence and character, which is a what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's a monster combo right there. I mean, that's the real deal. That's a real deal combo. To have intelligence and character, that's a big deal. You have people that are of very high intelligence, but are morally corrupt, or whatever it is. Again, I'm not judging anybody specific. I'm just saying Then you have people that are of very refined and we would call in Yiddish edel, very gentle, very good character, but maybe aren't the most intellectual individuals. A prophet is someone who has the IQ and the EQ, right? Someone who has the intelligence and the emotional character and temperament that is on a high level. That's who a prophet is. I mentioned before, in the middle of that paragraph, the idea of David Koresh, Branch Davidians, Waco, 1993. Well, I probably don't need to remind you of the fact that I was just reminded in the podcast, so it's, I guess, maybe fresher in my mind, how David Koresh one day tells all his people, hey guys, guess what? I got a prophecy. Oh, what was the prophecy, David? Oh, I'm going to marry all of your wives. How convenient, right? Oh, I'm sorry, you have to now give all your wives to God's prophet. There you go. All right. That in Judaism, it's not a red flag, right? I don't know what's beyond a red flag. That's like, I don't even know how to like properly express how absolutely impossible that would ever be from a Jewish perspective. You can't. That's not kosher. I mean, that's like I know I'm like understating it. That's not. It can't even be a thing. Okay. By the way, one more parenthetical point. I've been thinking about this a few times during these texts, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but I'll mention it right now. Although Maimonides or this translation uses the pronoun he regarding prophets, we know in Jewish history that there were Jewish prophetesses, if that's the right way to say it, the feminine version. In other words, there were women who were prophets also. So it's not only for men, it's not a masculine thing. Famously, Deborah was a prophet, Miriam was a prophet, and others were prophets. So it's not gender, it's not limited to a certain gender. Okay, let's go to number 2. Second qualification of prophecy. There are many levels of prophecy, Maimonides continues, in the same way that one person can be wiser than another, so can he be more prophetic, right? Just like wisdom has different levels, intelligence has different levels, so too prophecy. With the exception of the prophet of Moses, prophetic insights come only in nocturnal visions, in dreams, or by day after falling asleep. This is interesting. He says prophets, with the exception of Moses, which we'll talk about in a moment with principle number 7, these prophetic insights are kind of when the person's mind is open and tuned to the right frequency, but when they are not in a normative state of consciousness. It's only in dreams, visions, or daydreams. It's kind of like when a person's consciousness is a bit suspended, they're more tuned to kind of connect with that divine act of intelligence. When one is receiving a prophecy, one's limbs shake, the strength of one's body weakens, and one's thoughts become disturbed, leaving one's mind free to understand what one will see. Okay, listen, I can't tell you more than what it says here. When I have my prophetic experience and all that happens, I'll let you know what it feels like. Until then, I can just tell you what it says here. Number 3, what is made known to a prophet during prophecy is done so by way of parable, and he will immediately realize what the parable means. In other words, the prophet is not given the direct information, whatever that is, or the message. It's kind of a parable, but the parable is very obvious to the one who is the prophet. All of the prophets, except Moses, prophesied by way of parables and riddles. Number 4, none of the prophets received prophecies whenever they wanted, but they would attune their thoughts, be happy and of a good heart, and no melancholy prophets, and seek solitude. For prophecy does not come to those who are sad or lazy, but only to those who are happy. It's another important point. If you want to be a prophet, and who doesn't, right? So be happy. It's another reason to stay positive. Number 5, those who seek prophecy are called the sons of prophets. Even though they attune their thoughts, the divine presence may or may not inspire them. There's no guarantee. That sounds like a radio commercial. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Your mileage may vary. Please call. Right? So that's like the government disclaimer. As Maimonides says, you can follow all the rules and do all that stuff. May not be a prophet, which reminds me of a fantastic story. I love this story. It's a Hasidic story. It goes back a few hundred years, where there was a man who was very distraught, and he comes to his rabbi and he says, "Rabbi, I don't understand what's wrong." He says, "Tell me what's wrong." He says, "Look, I've been preparing myself for the last 30 days. I've been, only eating basic food like water and basic sustenance. I've been avoiding talking and gossiping, and I've been aligning myself, trying to block out any distracting thoughts, and being very pure-minded and simple living and all that stuff. And it says in the books that's a way to get prophecy. And look, I haven't got prophecy." And the rabbi smiles and says, My horse also hasn't done any of those things either, and the horse is not a prophet either. In other words, there's no guarantee. It's like, yeah, you did all these things, good, mazel tov, it's a good thing, but it doesn't guarantee the experience of prophecy. Anyway, maybe there's also a little bit of critique there also about the character, but that's another analysis of stories, which we don't have time for right now. What we've seen so far, though, is that prophecy at its core is another way for God's presence to be manifest in a finite environment within a finite human mind. But it's reserved for those that are on a certain stature, on a certain level, and open to it in a certain way. We see also, I'll mention it again, the power of happiness, the power of joy and being of a positive disposition, that keeps us in tune, even if we're not looking for prophecy. I don't know anyone who's like pining for that experience, but it's always good to maintain a positive disposition. Text number 5 is really important. How do we know that someone's really a prophet? How do we know? Someone says, hey, I'm a prophet, I got all these messages. Hey, follow me. How do we know? We have some clues so far based on the criteria that we just mentioned. They have to be wise and of really upstanding character. But here, Maimonides continues to give some more details. We don't believe that just anyone who performs a miracle or a wonder is a prophet. Text 5. Maimonides says, if somebody pulls something off that looks kind of amazing, and you're not sure how they did it, and their name is David Copperfield, you can remain skeptical. Rather, a person whom we already know to be worthy of prophecy, by virtue of his wisdom and his deeds, as we said before, right? If you know somebody's a mensch, you know they're a good person, and you know they're very wise, and you know they're really, really upstanding, they're really special, in which he surpasses his peers in wisdom and deeds, and who treads the paths of the prophets in terms of sanctifying himself. Whoa, that's really curved. And detaching himself from worldly matters. Yes, that's very important. Who then comes and performs a miracle or wonder saying that God sent him. Fine, then such a person, it is a mitzvah to obey. Obey meaning that if they give you a message, then you might want to listen to it. But the prerequisite for this, like we said before, in the criteria of how to become a prophet, is it has to be somebody of really upstanding character. Somebody who's a true, through and through mensch, who is not hedonistic, who's not using this as a whole ruse in order to get people, to get money, to get fame, to get women, to get whatever it is. Only then, a charismatic cult leader that convinces everybody to follow them and give them everything. I watched another documentary recently, actually maybe last year, of that dude in Oregon. Was it in Oregon? The guy from India? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? No? Like years ago, like a few decades ago, this might have been in the early 80s actually, not that long ago, came from India, and he said that he was this prophet and this dude, and he was revered, and he had all these white Rolls Royces. No? Does it jog a memory? No? Nothing? Okay, whatever. Again, I saw a documentary on this. It was just fascinating. I'm just fascinated by this topic about how people get pulled into these things. But whatever. The bottom line is that if somebody is attached to worldly matters, okay, then it's they're off the table. You know it's not legit. From a Jewish perspective, that's not that person can't be a conduit for the prophecy. So it's about a very, very high level of intelligence, but also moral, ethical, and spiritual character. I'm sure I've been repeating this several times, so I'm assuming that this makes sense. Okay. No, we don't need that. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, I'm skipping a few texts, but that's fine. Let's look at this next thing. My scan. We scanned in the book here. The scan has got a little bit crooked in the scan, but hopefully you can still read it. I'm referring to text number 8. Is there prophecy today? That's our next question. Well, what about today? Bottom line, Is prophecy like an ancient thing? With Samuel and Elijah and Elisha and all those guys, Isaiah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah, right? All the old-time prophets. Or is there some sort of prophecy today? It's interesting. The Talmud says that there's no prophecy anymore. The Talmud was written about 1600 years ago. However, there's still remnants of prophecy that you and I are also privy to, which we'll explore in a moment. This is a bit of an exciting pivot in this class. So stay with me. Is there prophecy today? Text number 8. From the statement of our sages, this is from the Talmud, when the last of the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi died, divine inspiration, Ruach HaKodesh, departed from the Jewish people. It appears, based on that statement from the Talmud, it appears that no prophet can arise during our times. But this is not so. For even after that era, Ruach HaKodesh, which is divine inspiration, manifested itself. Rather, the intention of the Talmudic statement is that it is not as frequent as formerly, not that it has completely ceased. Since prophecy is only granted to one who has achieved a number of superior qualities and levels, which are a preparation of prophecy, and that is not so prevalent today. Accordingly, if a person is worthy of prophecy, Ruach HaKodesh and prophecy will rest upon him even in our times. This is kind of cool. It's potentially possible for someone to have some sort of element of divine inspiration. Again, who might that be? Is it legit? How do we know? And what does it mean for all of us? These are questions that require a lot of analysis and a healthy dose of skepticism. However, is it theoretically possible? The answer is yes. But I want to share with you now what I think is kind of exciting, which is a classic Jewish teaching. And that says that there is an element of prophecy that every parent has. When a parent names their child, there's an old, long-standing Jewish tradition that when a parent names a child, they are infused with an element of prophecy. They don't know it. They'll never know it, right? We don't know it when we name our children, but the reality is, Judaism teaches that a person is granted a gift of prophecy, and that's how they know which name is associated with the soul, with the spiritual energy of that child. So, take that for what it's worth. It's an interesting teaching, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to think that on some level we're all granted some sort of information from time to time that can filter through. I also want to mention that there is a notion of premonition as well. That is a mini form of prophecy that many people have experienced. I'll ask you a question. Let me stop sharing so I can see everybody. So, has anyone had the experience, or do you know of anyone who had this experience, where you've dreamed of someone, and in the dream they pass away, and in a very short amount of time, that person in real life actually passed away? Does anybody have an experience where they had a dream themselves, or they know someone who had a dream like that? By raise of hand, anybody? Yes? I'm going to raise my hand. Okay. So, and I know I see some thumbs up as well on the screen. This is not as uncommon as you might think. And it happens from time to time where a person will have a dream about someone else, and the person passes away. And it's not that the dream causes it, obviously. I mean, but that that person in their dream, they were granted some sort of insight or vision into something that was going to transpire. My grandfather, this once happened to him. He had a dream about a neighbor who was not in poor health. The neighbor was healthy. He had a dream about a neighbor passing away, and it was like he was very frightened by it. And shortly thereafter, the neighbor passed away in a very unexpected way. So it's how do you make sense of it? one way to make sense of it is understanding that there is divine active intelligence that is like these radio waves, this divine plan or whatever you want to call it is around us. And if somebody's a prophet, they can tune into it, on occasion or whatever. But also, and anyone, maybe everyone, perhaps might have an experience where maybe when they're sleeping, when their soul is a little bit less stuck inside the body, and they're a little bit more of an unconscious or superconscious state, where they might encounter one of those messages or one of those intuitions. Anyway, so take that for what it's worth. The notion of intuition, what I presented in the text, but just know that it's theoretically possible for these things to happen. Any questions or comments thus far before I jump into Moses discussion? No? Okay. Let's quickly talk about Moses. We have a few minutes to talk about Moses. So who was Moses? Moses was, of course, the great Jewish leader who God handpicks to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, or to help lead the Jewish people out of Egypt. And Moses is described in Torah, in the Bible, as being a prophet par excellence, unsurpassed. In fact, the Torah says at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the 5 books, it says, V'lo kam navi Yisrael od kemoshe. There will never arise a prophet in Israel like Moses, who spoke to God face to face, etc. There is no one that ever was or will ever be a prophet on the level of Moses. Let's look at how Maimonides articulates principle number 7 and how he speaks about the prophecy of Moses. Here we go, text number 9. The 7th principle involves Moses. We know that Moses was the chief, was the chief of all prophets, whether they preceded him or arose afterwards. We know that because the Torah tells us as such. Moses attained the highest possible human level. He perceived the divine to a degree surpassing every human being that ever existed or will ever exist. There was no veil that he did not tear aside or penetrate. In other words, there was no opacity in his awareness of this divine intelligence. Nothing held him back. He was not tainted by any deficiency, great or small. His thoughts, senses, and feelings ceased to exist entirely. His conscious mind became completely detached from materialism and became pure intelligence. And again, I'm adding some words here, aligned with the divine. Take a look at text number 10. Again from Maimonides, his mind was continually bound to the creator of all worlds, and the glory never left him. He became as holy as an angel, in human terms at least. The Torah thus states his face radiated beams of light, which I smile as I read that verse in English, because the Hebrew is v'karan. If you can read the Hebrew in text 10, the second line, v'karan ar panav, it says his face radiated beams. Karan means beams, which is why the famous depiction of Moses by Michelangelo, right? I think it's Michelangelo who depicts Moses having horns, right? You know this depiction, the statue of Moses that has little horns coming out of his head. This was a depiction of the rays of light. Unfortunately, from this came the misconception, or the whatever you want to call it, that says Jews have horns. You ever heard that thing before, that notion of Jews have horns? Well, there you go. This is where it's from. It's from this verse. His face radiated beams of light, which was then depicted in art as kind of beams shooting out from his head. And now we pay the price for artistic depiction. Great. Thank you very much. But that's the evolution of that. But getting back to this point, Moses is unique because although every prophecy is a human being kind of tuning into this divine intelligence, Moses tunes in the purest way that's possible for a human being and remain human, right? So he's still a human being, but he is aligning and tuning in with such clarity. It's like high definition radio. It's like the really sweet sounding tunes. It's like totally tuned in, no distortion in the frequency, and Moses was able to connect on that level. And why is this important for us to know? Why is this number 7 of the 13 principles of faith? Again, it's really about God's presence in our world, how God is so accessible and makes himself so accessible to us, to the extent that Moses, someone on that caliber, which will never again exist on that caliber, but theoretically someone on Moses' caliber could become so merged with the divine and still remain a human being. That's kind of cool. That shows that level. Now, lest you think that Judaism is ascribing divinity to human beings, now we have the final message of today's class. And this also is a very important thing to remember when you hear about cults and cult leaders. Again, I'm coming from this fresh podcast of Waco and David Koresh, but here's the final point that I want to mention. Judaism does not believe in human beings taking the place of God. I'll say it again. Judaism does not subscribe to the notion or to the idea that a human being becomes in the place of God. And in order to connect, you have to connect to the human being instead of connecting to God. Moses was a connector. You see that on this page. We don't have time to read the text, but you see this little header in the other, and says, no, if you want to get there, you have to go through me. And then there's another connector that creates the connection and then gets out of the way. Moses was of the latter form, and Judaism only believes that a leader or a righteous person, a tzaddik, etc., a Moses, the only valid role in that, the only valid role of that role, I don't know if that's a good usage of those words, of that word, but the only valid form of that role is where that leader is not getting in the way, is not saying, you need to connect with me to connect with God. Like, you have to believe in me or else you're not connected. That's putting a human being in the way of God, and that is not kosher according to Judaism. So as we encounter principle number 7, which speaks about the prophecy of Moses, we immediately encounter Jewish teachings, text 11, text 12, text 13. Hold on, let me skip a page here. Text 13, text 14, talking about Moses as a funnel and not as a separation. But we immediately encounter Jewish texts that explain the role of Moses and the role of leaders, Jewish leaders throughout all time. Judaism does not believe, and this is very important, I know I'm emphasizing this, but it's important because you think about other religions and other faiths and other beliefs, and it's very different. Judaism does not believe in a human being becoming an intermediary or taking the place of God. Judaism believes that there's only one God, and that reminds me of the joke about the Jewish couple who sends their kid to a Catholic school because they wanted him, it was a good academically, and the kid comes home one day and starts talking about the Trinity. Oh, these were Jewish atheists. And but so they sent it to the Catholic school, and the kid comes home talking about the Trinity. They sit him down, they say, listen, young man, there's only one God, and we don't believe in him. So that's the message here. So anyway, it's not about anything else, but about Jewish beliefs, and that is Judaism believes that we're connected. Each one of us is connected with God. The role of a leader is to help us connect directly with God, not to stand in the way of that connection. It's a difference. It's like a shadchan, like a matchmaker. A matchmaker's role is to introduce, to let two people meet each other, but then get out of the way. You don't want your shadchan, you don't want your matchmaker in the back seat on your date, or sitting next to you at the restaurant. That's overstepping the role. So the role of a Moses, the role of a tzaddik, the role of a Jewish leader, the role of a spiritual leader throughout all the generations has always been to encourage each one of us to find our own personal one-on-one relationship with God. That relationship is attainable because God is attainable, and this is the overarching, the big picture of principles 6 and 7, which talk about prophecy. With that, we conclude formally today's lesson, and at this point, let's open it up. Anyone has questions or thoughts about today's lesson?